Hello, Libby. Happy
Good
Monday.
morning.
It's
Happy
not
Monday.
only it's not only a new week, it's also a new month.
February.
So, what does that mean for us? A new theme.
New word.
A new word. Not surprisingly, starts with a C. So, our word for this month is
Community.
community. Yeah. And you know what? It actually fits very well with some things that I've been taking a look at and listening to. I have to say, I have a challenge with podcasts because I find them a bit long sometimes. 45 minutes, an hour, that's just too long for me to listen to. But I found what are called some shortcasts that are under 15 minutes. They're great. They're the perfect length of time. And one that I have been obsessed with lately is the Happiness Lab. And
Mm.
it's with Dr. Laurie Santos. And yeah, she's a psychologist. And she's really focused on, how do you bring more happiness in? And so each episode has to do with that. And one that really spoke to me recently was all about loneliness and how we have to, well, essentially, loneliness is starting to be a little bit of an epidemic, and this is before the pandemic.
Right, pre-COVID.
People are rating loneliness at double the rates that they were in the 80s pre-COVID. And then we're finding, obviously, the past year, people have really found themselves in situations where they're not interacting with others and engaging with others, and it's really doing putting a big hit on our mental health and happiness levels. I think both of us found similar stats about how bad loneliness can be.
Right, like it's the equivalent, I think, of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Isn't that
15 cigarettes a day, yeah.
That's scary. I mean, you dig into the data on loneliness as an epidemic, and like the health implications lead to all the way to loneliness can cause death, like premature death. Like that is nuts. And you know what's funny? As I was listening to you talk, what's so interesting is we're living in the most interconnected world in the history of humanity and civilization. And yet this hyper connectedness that is available to us all the time in some way seems to actually increase feelings of social isolation and loneliness. That's sort of upsetting and disturbing.
Yeah, I think, we could get into a whole other episode on that one, but it's because many times we're not actually using it to connect to people, right? We're using it to compare to people. And so I think if they're used to actually create those connections and, reach out to people or find your people, then they can be quite effective. But unfortunately, even though they're called, social marketing or social networking, all of those, I've joked before that it really should be called scroll networking because it's just
or like you said, like social comparison, right? Yeah. Like that's where so much of it happens. So we chose this word community. Obviously it makes sense because we are creating community through the C factor in 2021. And what I was thinking about is just this need to feel like we belong to something bigger than ourselves. So a sense of belongingness. And we are very thoughtful about that in our face-to-face leadership programs. So I was sharing with a group the other day, back when we were gathering together in person, I would always have a challenge every session to just sort of bring an element of fun and excitement. So one of my favorite ones was Crazy Sock Game. So it was everyone needs to come to this session with like the craziest pair of socks that they can, find. There will be prizes, we'll take pictures, it'll be fun. But it is those very intentional things that we do to create this sense of we belong to one another, we're a part of something. And as silly as that may sound, socks create belongingness, but it creates a sense of we, doesn't it? And managers, supervisors, those people that you and I call established leaders, they often are tasked with creating community and belongingness for their team. But if you dig into the research, a lot of people who are in that position in an organization often report back that they feel very lonely in their jobs. They feel a lack of belonging.
Yeah, many times because, you go back to that saying of it's lonely at the top. And even
Right.
though, especially those in middle management, like it's not the top, but there is that separation between those who report to them and themselves. And since they're oftentimes left to their own devices to make these decisions, it can feel very isolating, and they don't know, they don't have people to go to. And so while they're tasked with building this sense of community for their team, and that's really important, many times they haven't spent the time to build their own communities as well.
Right. Well, and there's a little bit of risk taking, isn't there, to reach out to other peers and colleagues
Yeah.
who are at that level. Internally, it
Internally. Yeah.
doesn't it? Because if I'm vulnerable with you and I tell you I'm struggling or I'm having a hard time to my peer or colleague internally, there could possibly be some repercussions that come with being that open and vulnerable. And so our push in terms of this conversation, not only this conversation, but the bigger conversation is we want to create a space where our leaders at that level can gather together with other people from different organizations, geographies, etc. And you can create that sense of belongingness and community with one another. So, as this is a much bigger conversation outside of what you and I are having today, maybe as we wrap up, like what's just like one thing you would tell an established leader that they can do right now to start creating that sense of belonging?
I think for leaders right now is, you can do the activities like you said, because they do elicit that conversation. So it's funny, as much as people say they like hate icebreakers, they don't want to do that, they don't want to share it, actually results in some really good conversations and increases even the empathy on the team. Like people understand a little bit better where people are coming from and their backgrounds, and creating, like you said, that sense of belonging there. But another one, and I think we're going to talk about it more next week, is helping people realize the why, right? So, why is the team working towards certain goals? And that right there can be an instant belonging booster.
Right. And because coffee is such an important part of my day, I would recommend to anyone who's an established leader to start calendaring
Mm-hmm.
every week time to have 10 to 15-minute conversations with someone who is an established leader. It can be internal, but it can also be external. And just reach out this week to 2 or 3 people and say, would you have time for maybe a little coffee chat, or in your case, a tea chat? There doesn't have to be an agenda. There doesn't
Yeah.
need to be an end result. You don't need to like take anything away. It's just the connectedness, the time that we connect with one another to just check in and chat with one another. Lots of C words, by the way.
I know.
So many
Nice job.
coffee, check in, chat,
Conversation.
But it's sort of like what you and I do every Monday. We have an agenda of work that needs to get done, but we always start sometimes to our own.
Sometimes longer than others.
We connect first and
Yeah.
we chat with one another on what our weekend was like and what we're up to. And we end up talking about challenges that even we're facing.
Yeah.
And it is through those conversations that we're building a deeper sense of trust with one another. We're vulnerable with one another. I think we also get to practice empathy with one
Mm-hmm.
another as we listen with curiosity. And it is those kinds of conversations where you start to build community. We want established leaders to come into our community to experience that. But for now, just put the training wheels on, reach out and have a couple of conversations with people who are established leaders and see what that feels like to start creating that sense of community.